Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Bradlaugh Lecture. I'm Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive of the National Secular Society, and very sorry that we can't be doing this in person in Manchester as we'd hoped. But as you know, the rail strikes have put pay to that. I guess every cloud does have a silver lining, and on the plus side, I think we probably are being joined this afternoon by people who wouldn't have been able to make it into Manchester today. So welcome, all of you. Now, the annual Bradlaugh Lecture is named after Charles Bradlaugh, the man behind me, who was also the founder of the National Secular Society back in 1866. So Bradlaugh was in fact born this very week in 1833, went on to become a truly great Victorian radical secularist and parliamentarian. Bradlaugh knew all about what it was like to be on the receiving end of religious intolerance, because despite being elected as an MP by the people of Northampton, Bradlaugh was not allowed to take his seat in Parliament. He wasn't allowed to take the religious oath, and therefore his seat as an MP, and that was all because of his well-publicised atheist beliefs. And when he finally won the fight for the right to take his seat, Bradlaugh was instrumental in bringing about a change in the law, bringing forward the Oaths Act as a private member's bill to ensure that non-religious MPs could affirm rather than have to swear a religious oath in order to sit in Parliament. And today we're still working on multiple fronts to challenge religious privilege and discrimination, and to secure equality, and to ensure that everyone is able to live their lives free from the imposition of other people's beliefs and practices. Now, the values that Bradlaugh espoused, equality, justice, fairness, free speech, individual liberty in an open secular democracy, are still the values that the National Secular Society are proud to promote and defend to this day. And these are the values that I think have been at the heart of today's speakers campaigning now for over 40 years. So Pragna Patel is the founding member and a former director of Southall Black Sisters, an advocacy and campaigning group set up to provide support for Black and minority women facing a range of issues, but not least domestic violence and abuse. She's also the co-founder of Women Against Fundamentalism, which was formed by a collective of women, bloody difficult women, I think is the correct phrase, who recognized that the protests that followed the release of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses were a sign of a global resurgence in religious fundamentalism, and, well, how right they were. So Pragna has been and continues to be a courageous and principled campaigner, not only against religious fundamentalism, but also racism, misogyny, patriarchy, and the regressive politics of identity, of which we see so much of today. And in doing so, she's been a real inspiration to me and everyone here at the NSS, and she's been an absolutely fantastic advocate for secularism, equality, and universal human rights. And I'm absolutely delighted that she's joining us today to tell her story. So Pragna will speak for around 45 minutes, up to an hour perhaps, and then we'll put your questions to her. So if you have any questions, do please pop them over to me via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and without further ado, let me hand you over to Pragna Patel.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for such a generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can I say, first of all, what an honor and privilege it is for me to be invited to deliver this year's Bradlaugh Lecture, and to follow in the footsteps of stalwarts like Geeta Sehgal, who has been a close friend and a partner in crime for many years, and Jeffrey Robertson, with whom I worked on one of our most high-profile cases, that of Girinja Ahluwalia, and in Nazar Afzal, with whom SBS has worked on cases of forced marriage and honor-based violence, including the tragic case of Banaz Mahmood, who was raped and killed by her father and male relatives in 2006, and whose body was dumped in a suitcase and buried in Birmingham. I want to start by making an admission. I didn't know much about Charles Bradlaugh, but having done some quick background reading about the origins of the National Secular Society, I was fascinated to learn that the early period of British secularism was closely bound up with working class struggles, which were in turn influenced by the French Revolution. In an NSS tribute to Charles Bradlaugh in 2021, it was noted that throughout his life, Bradlaugh was a friend of the underdog, the underprivileged, and the downtrodden. He was a trade union activist as well as being a free thinker. If Bradlaugh were alive today, I can't help thinking that he would have supported the feminist struggles of groups like Southall Black Sisters for trying to forge a path that aligns the principles of equality and freedom with democracy and secularism. It is with this in mind that I decided to use the opportunity today to remind us all that there was a time, and I call this the pre-Rushdie period, when Black anti-racist struggles in the UK in the 70s and 80s were progressive, secular, and located within wider working class struggles and social justice movements. SBS is an inheritor of that legacy, a legacy that has for the last 2 decades been on the critically engendered list due to the rise and domination of regressive identity politics on both the right and left of the political spectrum. But what I had not fully appreciated is that even before the emergence of groups like SBS, Black women were engaged in a range of political struggles, particularly in the workplace, and that it was these struggles that paved the way for groups like SBS to emerge. In the early 70s, women fought not only against racism and discrimination in the workplace, but also challenged stereotypical views of women, minority women. And without them, there could not have been an SBS. And this brings me to Leicester, and there is a connection, I promise. What is going on there at this moment? We have seen for the first time significant communal violence flare up between Hindus and Muslims in the UK. The identity of the men involved, and they are only men, participating in the violence and in the protests on the street is not yet clear. But what is known is that they've been mobilized by Hindu and Muslim fundamentalist politics, both here and abroad, and by the spread of misinformation on social media that has also become an essential part of the communalization process. Politicians and community leaders in Leicester have talked about their shock and horror at the eruption of communal tensions in what is widely regarded as an otherwise harmonious and cohesive city. For decades, Leicester has been promoted as a model of cohesion and multiculturalism. But clearly this is not the case, and probably hasn't been for a long time, given the ways in which state policies on multiculturalism and now multi-faithism have entrenched right-wing faith-based leaderships in local political structures that are themselves the key drivers of communalism. The intended aim of such leaderships is to achieve the very opposite of cohesion. I can't help but think that the chickens have come home to roost, so to speak. But what has been the response to this? Sadly, it is largely focused on a call for more interfaith networks. But Leicester wasn't always like that. Many of those who settled in the 50s in places like Leicester and Southall came from India and Pakistan and were of Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu backgrounds. They had witnessed the horrors of partition and religious hatred in the Indian subcontinent. They were joined in the early 70s by Asians from East Africa who held British passports, but faced widespread hostility when they tried to assert their right to settle in the UK. 1972 saw an influx of Ugandan and Asian refugees into Leicester after Idi Amin expelled them as part of his murderous dictatorship. Many went to Leicester undeterred by the council's attempts to keep them out. Leicester Council had in fact put ads in the newspapers warning Ugandan Asians not to come to Leicester because there were no jobs or housing or services for them. Incidentally, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Ugandan expulsions. Throughout the decade that followed, Asians who settled in Leicester engaged in an anti-racist fight back that saw Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus uniting to confront members of the National Front, which, as many of you will know, was a far-right fascist movement that used violence to promote its racist and anti-immigration agenda. Leicester is also the city where South Asian strikers from Imperial typewriters fought together in 1974 in what was a secular struggle for equal pay and better working conditions. They worked side by side to deal with the challenges of racism and poverty. And those from communist, trade union, and socialist backgrounds created secular organizations like the Indian Workers Association to help people in their everyday struggles for housing, employment, and racial equality. But the most remarkable thing, I think, about the Imperial typewriter strike is that it was led by South Asian women, or mainly by South Asian women. They were, in fact, the forerunners of Jayabhen Desai and other women who went on to lead the seminal Gromwick strike of 1976 in northeast London. The point I want to make is that the strikers at Imperial typewriters not only faced down their bosses, but also officials of their union and many white workers who were also bolstered by the National Front, which had mobilized against the strikers with slogans such as "Send them back" and "It's your country, fight for it, join the National Front." The strike, which lasted for 3 months and received wide support from the South Asian community, was ultimately unsuccessful, partly because the union leaders refused to make the strike official. The 70s and 80s also saw many workplace struggles across the UK, including in and around Southall, shaking not only management, but also the trade union movement out of its complacency. Strikers at Wolf's and Quaker Oats in Southall, Gutterman's in Perivale, Trico in Bradford, and Chicks in Slough all highlighted a range of problems, including appalling working conditions, poor health and safety, low wages, and management divide and rule tactics. These strikes were important for many reasons. Firstly, they signaled unity, which was hard fought for, but nevertheless saw not only minorities from different backgrounds, but also white workers joining in. For example, dockers who had once marched in support of Enoch Powell marched in solidarity with the Gromwick strikers. Secondly, it was not only the workers themselves, but also increasingly the youth who took an interest in these struggles. And thirdly, they signaled a wave of activism among South Asian women in particular, who led many of these struggles. Jack Dromey MP, now sadly deceased, was the secretary of the Brent Trades Council during the Gromwick dispute and a close comrade of Desai. He recalled how she stood before a meeting of more than 80 husbands, fathers, and brothers of women who worked at Gromwick, and after it was alleged that their families did not approve of the women joining the picket lines, told the meeting, "We, the women, are determined to make a stand and nobody will get in the way of that, including from within our own families." The women's protests were all the more remarkable because they were waged by a generation of Black and minority women and men who were not represented by the old labor movement and their institutions. These struggles, to my mind, are critical in forging a secular anti-racist identity in which the issue of religion had no significance. Moreover, they paved the way for other struggles against racial violence, discriminatory immigration policies, and the rise of the far right in places like the East End of London, Southall, and Bradford, and to the formation of the Asian Youth Movement, a branch of which later went on to form the United Black Youth League. They were made up of largely of men from Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, and Christian backgrounds, whose politics borrowed heavily from the American Civil Rights Movement and the anti-colonial struggles that were taking place around the world. Their forms of resistance to defend their communities from racial violence mirrored the experiences of African Caribbean youth who had been involved in mobilizations against police racism and violence in places like Notting Hill in the early 70s. Their slogan, "Self-defense is no offense," was first coined in these anti-racist struggles. And much later, as Black feminists, we appropriated these slogans, and this one in particular, in the fight against violence against women in our communities. In Southall in 1979, 3 years after the racist murder of Gurdeep Singh Chadha in 1976, the National Front marched through the community and tried to hold a meeting in Southall Town Hall. Thousands from the community, men and women, young and old, as well as anti-racist activists from outside the area, came to stop the fascists. The ensuing struggle against the racist and police brutality led to around 700 predominantly young Asian men being arrested and charged with various public order offenses. It also led to the killing of Blair Peach, for which no police officer has ever been brought to justice, and to the destruction of an Afro-Caribbean music center called People's Unite, that also included a vicious police assault on the center's lead singer, Clarence Baker, who was found unconscious, and he remained in a coma for 5 months. This much of Southall's history is well known and documented, but what many people don't know is that on the day of the racial uprisings, around 20,000 local workers went on unofficial strike to support the protest, the anti-racist protest. They knew that the battle against racism had to be fought both on the streets and at work. Southall Black Sisters was born soon after the 1979 anti-racist community defense of Southall, in which young women of diverse backgrounds had participated alongside male community activists. SBS was established as an autonomous organization by women of many different backgrounds. It was a campaigning group that grew out of the women's frustration with the failure of the anti-racist movement to deal with the question of misogyny and sex discrimination, including sexual harassment within the Asian youth movement. At the same time, Southall Black Sisters also sought to challenge the wider burgeoning feminist movement for its failure to deal with the question of race. Our political position was by no means unique. We worked with other Black feminists at the time to develop a secular Black socialist feminist movement. We were members of a sister body called the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent, OWAD, which became a critical space within which to forge a common agenda based on shared political values. Recently, I came across their newsletter, FOWAD, which contains a remarkable statement of intent. It formed the blueprint for the Black feminism that we were to develop, and I think it's worth quoting. As Black socialist feminists, it is incumbent upon us to point out that when women's oppression is inextricably bound up with the issues of race and class, and that it is right and necessary to tackle all three simultaneously and with equal determination. However, having declared the inextricable links between race, class, and sex, we have the responsibility to carry through the political arguments with regard to feminism. This means that the thrust of our work will have two strands. On the one hand, we will continue to organize autonomously and address the issues we face as Black women. On the other, we must bring a feminist perspective to the work of our comrades in mixed progressive Black organizations. In this way, we will be raising the consciousness of the Black community within the context of the totality of Black socialist politics. Much of SBS's early activism was dominated by secular struggles against racism and sexism, manifested in protests against homelessness, oppressive police stop and search practices, harsh immigration practices, such as the infamous virginity testing of Asian women, South Asian women coming to the UK as wives of British husbands, the forced sterilizations of women in the global South, and against patriarchal values that shape gender inequality. One of the first campaigns that was waged was against the murder of a local woman known as Mrs. Dillon, who was burnt to death along with 3 of her 5 daughters by her husband because she failed to produce a son. The early SBS members challenged the patriarchal traditions and values that justified such atrocities against women. I began my political life in 1982. At the age of 21, I came out of university in Liverpool and began to look for a political home, because as a young Asian woman, I needed to make sense of the racism, the poverty, and the patriarchy that had shaped my upbringing in the UK, which had made me feel as if I had no right to dream of a better life. The previous year, during the summer holidays from university, I had come upon a group of feisty young Black, Asian, and Afro-Caribbean feminists who called themselves Southall Black Sisters and who were selling their newsletters on the streets of Southall. I was blown over by the confidence and stridency of the women, because they announced themselves in the community not as victims, but as proud Black women taking back control, and I wanted to join them. However, soon after I joined SBS in 1982, I found myself having to breathe new life into the organization because it had more or less fizzled out. All the original members had left to pursue higher education and other careers and interests. Borrowing as much from earlier Black struggles as from the grassroots law centre movement, I resuscitated the group and set up a centre to provide frontline legal and advocacy support to Black and minority women, and to use their everyday experiences to campaign for wider change, both within the communities and within the state. Looking back, it's clear to me that the very inception of SBS was an act of dissent, because we charted our political journey towards a secular anti-racist feminism by both drawing from as well as challenging the orthodoxies of the feminist and anti-racist movements into which we were born. There are 3 aspects of Black feminist politics that we tried to forge that I want to highlight. First, as the earlier statement by Owad suggests, there was a genuine attempt to develop what is now referred to as an intersectional analysis, capable of connecting race, gender, and class as a way of thinking and doing feminism. In the 80s, second wave feminism as a political movement was in full swing on many fronts. There were campaigns for equal pay, the right to contraception and abortion, and shelters for victims of domestic violence. But SBS and other Black feminists began to challenge the movement for the lack of inclusion of Black and minority women's voices and experiences. We argued that these experiences were also political priorities for feminism, and that an analysis of these experiences provided a very different perspective on the state's relationship with women and with the institution of the family. Secondly, our politics involved mobilizing around the term Black, because we saw this as a secular and unifying identity, inclusive of all histories of colonialism and racism. Although this identity did not go uncontested within the community or in anti-racist circles, it was generally accepted as a secular and non-sectarian identity, with a focus very much on unity across class, caste, ethnicity, and religion, and with a focus on solidarity. For example, in the 80s, we were part of Black delegations to Northern Ireland and to the mining communities during the Great Miners' Strike of 1984. These were genuine attempts to build a politics of solidarity across difference and to locate ourselves as feminists within wider social justice movements, even though we had to contest these same movements for space and legitimacy as Black women. Ultimately, by trying to forge such alliances, we were also trying to bridge the gap between anti-racism, feminism, and progressive politics. In short, we understood that the struggle for women's rights involved the need to face many directions at the same time. And it was this Black identity that also led SBS to mobilize around violence against women, the dominant issue that confronted us in our frontline work, and an issue that crossed racial, ethnic, and religious lines. In 1984, we organized the first public protests against violence against women and girls in Southall. It was a bold move in a context where community leaders, including those working on racial discrimination, had kept a tight lid on issues such as domestic violence, forced marriage, suicide, and honor-based violence, which were deemed to be private matters to be resolved internally without state interference. The protests following the suicide of a local woman, Krishna Sharma, who was driven to kill herself after enduring years of violence, involved us taking to the streets. We were women from different backgrounds, and our aim was to name and shame Krishna Sharma's perpetrators publicly, and to question the legitimacy of religious and cultural values such as honor and shame that condoned violence against women and crushed women's hopes, aspirations, and freedoms. We surrounded the home of our husband and in-laws and demanded justice. Survivors of abuse, in fact, led the demonstrations and the pickets that we organized outside the home, outside the perpetrator's home. They came even though many had themselves fled abuse and had to appear in disguise. In this respect, we borrowed from the 1980s feminist movement in India, which campaigned in very public ways to shame perpetrators of dowry-related murders, in contexts where the Indian state continuously violated its duty to protect women. The significance of this is that our demonstrations and borrowing from these traditions of feminists abroad is that we were showing that feminism was not a Western concept, as was assumed by the leaders of our communities. In an effort to make common cause with all women who experience gender-based violence, we also joined the Krishna Sharma campaign with that of two others that were taking place at the same time. And they were also involved women who had experienced domestic violence. The first was that of Rubina Akram from Oxford, whose violent partner took an axe to her face and severely disfigured her for life. She was lucky to have survived. A couple of white women from a local women's center were supporting Rubina and bravely took up a case to ensure that her husband was not treated leniently by the police and prosecution services, because in those days, domestic abuse was not seen as a crime, and because they were concerned about the silence of the Asian community, as well as the wider society. The second case was that of Iqbal Begum from Birmingham, who had killed her violent husband and was jailed for life following a criminal trial that failed to take account of the abuse and cruelty that her husband had perpetrated, and had failed to provide a proper interpreter. Her campaign was led by Birmingham Black Sisters, who eventually succeeded in having her murder conviction overturned on the grounds that the lack of interpretation constituted a miscarriage of justice. We organized a public meeting in Southall so that all three campaigns could share experiences and work together to develop joint strategies for highlighting domestic abuse. Many survivors of abuse also attended these meetings and spoke of their own abuse and the need to challenge the hostility that they faced in their families and communities for speaking out. By inhabiting public spaces in this way, we tried to ensure that long suppressed accounts of domestic and sexual violence and injustice had to be acknowledged and addressed by the community and the state alike. Unlike the race mobilizations in Southall in 1979, born out of anger and rage and indignation, the same community responded to sexism and gender-based violence with silence. To those on the anti-racist left, we argued that there was no such thing as a homogeneous Black community or a pure, authentic Black identity that is defined only by opposition to racism. We argued that the patriarchal institutionalization of the inequalities and injustices faced by women and girls in their families and communities had to be challenged at the same time as the institutionalized racism of the state. And to the wider feminist movement, we argued that we were engaged in a common struggle and needed their support. Many in the feminist movement were fearful of being seen to interfere in the internal affairs of Black communities and of being labeled racist. But the high point of this work was the creation of a strong coalition of white and Black feminists in the early 90s, based on the case of Girinjit Ahluwalia and other battered women who killed their abusive partners and the injustices that they face within the criminal justice system as a result. In what is perhaps our most high-profile campaign, we successfully challenged Girinjit's murder conviction for killing her abusive husband following 10 years of abuse. Girinjit was initially convicted for her husband's murder, but at her trial at the court, the judge failed to take account of her experiences of abuse and a specific cultural context which made it difficult for her to leave her husband. Some of us had watched a US documentary entitled "I Killed My Husband and No One Asked Why," and realized that the experiences of battered women who kill in the American legal system resonated with our experiences and that of Girinjit too. We also remembered the case of Iqbal Begum a decade or so earlier, but as she was freed on a technicality, the failure of the state to provide proper interpretation, the issues raised about domestic violence and the criminal justice response to battered women who kill had never been properly raised. The campaign to free Girinjit brought together women, young and old, Black and white, activists, professionals, service users, and organizations in a series of really noisy and colorful protests that took place outside the Home Office on a weekly basis and at the Court of Appeal in 1984, when her appeal against her murder conviction was finally heard. And she was represented incidentally by Jeffrey Robertson QC and also by Andrew Nichol QC. The campaign not only led to her release from prison, but also to critical reforms of homicide laws, which was achieved precisely because we joined the campaign with that of others led by the organization Justice for Women, concerning white women like Sarah Thornton and later Emma Humphreys, who had also been jailed for killing their violent partners. These protests eventually led the government to abolish the discriminatory law of provocation, which was constructed around male norms of behavior, and by its very nature excluded an examination of the abusive context in which women kill out of fear, despair, and trauma, and which also excluded the very real social, cultural, and economic constraints that prevent women from exiting abuse. The law of provocation was eventually replaced by the law of self-control. And it was this reform that enabled many battered women since to defend themselves against the charge of murder in contexts where they are subject to prolonged abuse and violence and coercive control, and to limit its use by angry, jealous, and violent men who seek to excuse their behavior. Significantly, by linking the experiences of different South Asian women, Krishna Sharma was Hindu in background, Iqbal Begum, a Pakistani Mirpuri Muslim, Rubina Akram, a Pakistani Muslim. And by linking the campaigns around Girinjit Ahluwalia with those of other women in the wider society, we were able to talk in a secular language of universal justice, and in this way build solidarity and unity across difference in the struggle for female autonomy and freedom. Reflecting on these struggles now, I've come to understand that this was arguably the most striking aspect of these campaigns. I'm not saying that we didn't have our differences within the coalitions, but we were able to hold them together in what was a wonderful moment of sisterhood and solidarity. By mobilizing around domestic violence and gender inequality in our communities, we set ourselves not only against traditionalists and religious conservatives who sought to maintain the patriarchal status quo, but also against aspects of multiculturalism and even anti-racism that lapsed into narrow and essentialist identity politics based on religious affiliation. It is a politics that denied other forms of inequality born out of differential access to rights and resources within the community and the state. The rise of religious identity politics is, of course, a post-Rushdie phenomenon, and it has since led to a shift in politics from multiculturalism to multi-faithism. The struggle against multiculturalism and now multi-faithism from the late 80s onwards is the third aspect of our brand of feminism that I want to highlight. Although multiculturalism was a more enlightened race relations model as opposed to the earlier assimilation model of the 60s and 70s, nevertheless, it elevated the concept of diversity, which became an end goal in itself, whilst leaving untouched questions of structural or institutional forms of racial and gender inequality. We were the first feminist organization to mount a forceful critique of the politics of multiculturalism from a feminist perspective. It was a critique that challenged the idea of minority communities as homogeneous and unified without internal divisions of power along caste, class, sexuality, or gender lines. The multicultural model gave prominence to a politics of representation that placed self-appointed conservative and religious and leaderships and those from the business classes in positions of power as community gatekeepers and mediators. And these forces set about using their newfound positions to delegitimize secular feminist concerns around violence against women and the family, and instead promoted a culturally relativist approach to social policy and the law that reinforced patriarchal power relations and stifled internal struggles for human rights and democratic accountability. Whilst we maintain that multiculturalism had a part to play in challenging racism, we pointed out that it had very negative consequences for minority women. Against a backdrop of changing perceptions of women's socio-political role in the wider society, the lives of women in minority communities continued to be determined only by reference to cultural and religious values, which took precedence over fundamental rights and freedoms. Whilst increasingly visible feminist campaigns on violence against women in the wider society were finally receiving state recognition, multicultural approaches to Black and minority women had the effect of masking oppressive practices within minority communities and constraining minority women's bid for autonomy and rights. The consequences of adopting a hands-off approach to the family affairs of minority communities was the lack of state recognition for minority women's experiences of specific forms of harm, including forced marriage, honor-based violence, marital captivity, child abuse, and sexual and domestic slavery. Instead, institutional policies and practices dictated that they be tolerated to avoid causing offense to culture and religious sensibilities. The close connection between SBS's struggle against violence against women and the politics of multiculturalism is perhaps nowhere better encapsulated than in a case in which I was involved in 1989 concerning Afia, a young 13 Bangladeshi woman, a girl of Muslim background from East London. She had contacted SBS out of fear of being taken to Bangladesh during the school holidays and of being forced into a marriage by her father. Her eldest sister had run away from just this fate, and her father wanted to prevent Afia and her sisters from following suit. Afia approached social services for protection, but was met with indifference and inflexibility. Operating within a multicultural framework that involved consulting their so-called Asian experts, they rejected her fears of a forced marriage, stating that she was a typical young Asian adolescent experiencing nothing more than, I quote, a touch of the culture clash. With the help of SBS and her lawyers, Afia was temporarily made a ward of court. However, at a final court hearing, social services urged for the discontinuation of the wardship proceedings, stating that, in quotes, insensitive intervention in her family would diminish her father's confidence and authority and distort the balance of power within the family. In effect, social services argued that any state intervention would exacerbate the reality of racism in which the family lived and from which the father was trying to shield his daughters. The presiding judge agreed and decided to deward Afia, adding that there are bound to be stresses and strains in any family, but that does not mean that the state should intervene. However, by the late 90s and early 2000s, as a result of incessant campaigns and legal challenges on our part, we began to see a dramatic shift in British state policy on multiculturalism, which led to the famous announcement in Parliament by Mike O'Brien following a spate of honour killings of women like Ruxana Naz, and the creation of a Home Office working group on forced marriage. Mike O'Brien finally acknowledged in public that multicultural sensitivity is no excuse for moral blindness. There followed a spate of laws and policies such as the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act to protect women against forced marriage and honor-based violence, which a decade earlier had been deemed no-go areas by the state. These advances were made possible by our campaigns to ensure that the state adopted and promoted a rights-based approach to Black minority women and children. Such an approach has not only enabled us to challenge harmful cultural practices, but also institutional racism manifested in, for example, hostile immigration policies. In fact, some of SBS's most difficult but important and sometimes successful campaigns on violence against women are those that have also focused on the removal of immigration laws and policies that trap migrant women in abusive relationships. Immigration laws have been weaponized by perpetrators to maintain patriarchal control, and they have also served the interests of the state because they deny minority women the right to exit from abusive relationships, and they deny the women access to welfare services without fear of destitution and/or deportation. However, our attempts to develop a mature or progressive form of multiculturalism capable of reconciling diversity with universal rights and gender equality on the one hand, and of giving political space to ethnic minorities as citizens rather than subjects on the other, has stalled. This is due to a combination of the rise of the religious right, by which I mean forces of religious fundamentalism and conservatism, and the shift in government policy from multiculturalism to multi-faithism. This shift from multiculturalism to multi-faithism is a process that actually started in the aftermath of the Rushdie affair in 1989, but is accelerated under successive government policies on austerity and privatization on the one hand, and cohesion and integration into the so-called British way of life on the other. Taking place against a backdrop of rising racism and nationalism, it is a political position that both denigrates minorities and migrants, and at the same time embraces and strengthens regressive religious minority leaderships who have become emboldened in mobilizing around a set of demands that seek to protect religion from any form of dissent and scrutiny. The turning point in compelling groups like SBS to make explicit the link between gender equality and secularism was, of course, the Rushdie affair. SBS was the only feminist organization in the UK to respond to the resurgence of religious fundamentalism that we were seeing worldwide. We set up Women Against Fundamentalism, which was born in the midst of the furor surrounding the publication of Satanic Verses, which led to the fatwa calling for the killing of Rushdie by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who declared his work blasphemous and gave a cause for fundamentalists to mobilize around. The media had reduced the whole Rushdie affair, not without some cause, since the so-called anti-racist or progressive left was silent on the matter, but nevertheless reduced the debate as one between supporters of Rushdie, mainly artists and writers who were defending freedom of speech, and those who opposed Rushdie, mainly Muslim leaders, many of whom called for the book to be banned in defense of so-called freedom of religion, even though many had not read it. Women Against Fundamentalism is an organization of women from different ethnic and religious backgrounds attempted to break this polarity of representation. Our first act of defense was the now iconic Women Against Fundamentalism Protest at Parliament Square. Standing there facing thousands of angry young Muslim men led by opportunistic Muslim clerics and community leaders with transnational fundamental links, we drew connections between Rushdie's right to dissent and the feminist tradition of dissenting against the patriarchal contract, with slogans such as "Religious leaders don't speak for us," and "Not the church, not the state, women will decide their fate," and "Our tradition, struggle, not submission." Ironically, at the same time that we were protesting against the anti-Rushdie marchers, we also found ourselves confronting a small group of fascists and racists who had also used the moment to parade their anti-Muslim racism. They were outnumbered by about 1 to 2,000, and so they turned to us as the easier target. We were compelled to challenge both forces of the right at the same time. 1 minute defending off aggressive and violent Muslim men who were lunging at us and tearing down our banners, and the next confronting the Nazi salutes and fascist flag-waving young white men and women. Since 1989, we've witnessed the growth of fundamentalist and conservative religious identity politics and a corresponding communalization of minority communities, aided and abetted by state policies on multi-faithism, in which minorities are defined by their religion alone. The result is twofold. On the one hand, the state has legitimated a form of anti-democratic representative politics in minority communities that is dominated by the religious right, who is seen as the authentic voice of the communities to which they lay claim. And on the other hand, it's allowed for the accommodation of narrow definitions of religious identity linked to socially conservative agendas, in which the rights of women and girls in particular are threatened. Multi-faithism has also fostered an environment that is conducive to new configurations of masculinity and patriarchal control, radiating violence, fear, and censorship. For example, we have seen the use of conversion narratives to justify the vigorous policing of female sexuality by Hindu and Sikh fundamentalists, male youths. Fundamentalist Sikh youths have from time to time policed Sikh women's sexuality and organized protests against interfaith marriages taking place in gurdwaras. Using intimidation and threats, they disrupt such weddings, but the wider mischief that they're perpetrating is the attempt to impose a puritanical notion of Sikhism that is violent, sectarian, and intolerant. Such tactics have also long been utilized by Hindu as well as other Muslim religious right groups in the UK, not only to police the boundaries of religious affiliation, but also to claim ownership over women in particular. As a consequence, my work on violence against women in the last 3 decades or so has been directed at wresting control and power away from religious leaderships that deny women and children the right to access the formal legal system or other institutions of the state in order to assert their rights to protection, choice, and autonomy. I have seen how, in the face of a shrinking welfare state and cuts to services, including legal aid, a large proportion of minority women are being forced to resort to religious or community-based forms of arbitration and dispute resolution. But these are dangerous patriarchal processes that serve to enhance religious and social control and are ultimately even less amenable to accountability and gender justice. Added to this complexity is the fact that much of the so-called left progressive and feminist academic analysis and even activism is dominated by a simplistic one-dimensional view of anti-racism, Western imperialism, and post-colonialism that focuses only on terror and authoritarianism generated from above, but allows little or no room to critique cultural relativism and authoritarianism from below. Countering these developments has not been easy in a context where we have few allies. particularly in the defense of secularism. Nevertheless, we have soldiered on in the face of fundamentalist attempts to shrink secular spaces, set up faith schools, police dissent, and impose religious laws on marriage and the family, and impose strict dress codes and gender segregation in public spaces. To give some examples, in 2013 and 14, working with One Law for All, a key ally in our work, we initiated judicial review proceedings against the UK university's governing body, UUK, for issuing guidance approving gender segregation in public meetings on university campuses. And this was in breach of sex discrimination law. In the face of legal action, the governing body conceded the claim and withdrew their discriminatory guidance. That same year, we initiated judicial review proceedings against the Law Society, as you know, a regulatory body for solicitors, in respect of its so-called Sharia-compliant guidance in the drafting of wills that discriminated against women and children born outside of marriage. The threat of legal action and political campaigning by us and One Law for All led the Law Society to also withdraw their discriminatory guidance. In 2017, we campaigned alongside Dalit organizations to introduce a law on caste discrimination into the Equality Act in the face of strong Hindu and Sikh fundamentalist opposition, mobilized by the Alliance of Hindu Organizations, the National Council of Hindu Temples, and the Hindu Swayam Savak Sangh and HSS, an organization that is closely linked to the RSS, a right-wing Hindu nationalist paramilitary organization implicated in widespread religious and communal violence in India, and of course in the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. The government eventually decided against the law in the face of strong lobbying by the Hindu right, and despite having made a commitment to introduce the law in 2013, a move that had been endorsed by the UN. In 2017, alongside the organization Inspire, we also intervened in a Court of Appeal case in support of the Education Inspectorate at Ofsted, which was defending itself against charges of religious discrimination brought by the governing body of Al-Hijra, a primary co-ed faith school. The management of this school, the governing body, was deemed to be inadequate for a host of reasons, including allowing the practice of strict gender segregation that directly and indirectly discriminated against girls. Boys and girls between the ages of 9 and 16 were completely segregated for all lessons, breaks, school clubs, and trips. In addition, homophobic comments were tolerated, and contemporary textbooks condoning marital rape and domestic abuse were stocked in the school library. Our legal intervention sought to demonstrate that gender segregation was not a benign religious practice, but a fundamentalist attempt to impose a new sexual order that sought to constrain the educational opportunities and life chances of girls and to reinforce gender stereotypes and inequality. That same year, we joined community activists in Southall in a campaign to prevent the sale of Southall Town Hall by Ealing Council to a local Hindu temple. The town hall rose to prominence during the anti-racist struggles of 1979 and has since become a vital community space that houses a range of community activities, particularly for new migrants. Our campaign sought to preserve the building as a valuable community resource, and it was only one of 2 secular spaces left in the area, an area that is largely a deprived working class community in which religion has been the only growth industry. The Hindu temple to which the building was being sold was part of the Hindu lobby that had campaigned against the introduction of an anti-caste discrimination law in the UK. So you can imagine that it would never have been a civic and inclusive space for everyone. The temple was also represented on the executive committee of the National Council of Hindu Temples, They'd also recently hosted a meeting with the Hindu extremist Tapan Ghosh, a firebrand who has preached hatred and incited violence against Muslims. By the way, the Hindu Council of Temple had also, in previous years, hosted Tommy Robinson. And in 2020, we intervened in the Court of Appeal case of Akhtar versus Khan, which turned on the question of whether or not a woman in an unregistered religious marriage is entitled to financial remedies when her marriage breaks up. This was an appeal by the Attorney General against an earlier court decision that ruled that Mrs. Akhtar's religious-only marriage was void, which entitled her to a decree of nullity and to claim financial entitlements following the breakup of her marriage. SBS sought to intervene in the case because the outcome had significant implications for many Muslim women who are coerced into having a religious-only marriage, precisely so that they can be deprived of their marital rights following any breakup. We did not seek a validation of religious marriage in family law, but submitted instead that women must be allowed to void a religious marriage on the grounds of coercion to make sure that they're not locked out of the civil justice system and deprived of the protection and rights to which they're entitled. The Court of Appeal decided not to change the marriage system, but instead batted it back to the Law Commission, which has since reported on its recommendations, but has failed to grapple with the issue of religious coercion in a marriage. So by way of conclusion, I would like to make a couple of observations. The first one is that if feminism is to have a future, then we must urgently reclaim the secular histories of struggles waged by those who came before us, because they talked in the language of equality and universalism, and in doing so created the potential for building coalitions that are cross-cutting and outward-looking. Secondly, in the current dire political and economic climate globally, it is easy to despair and feel helpless, but there is hope. And it comes from movements for self-determination led by ordinary women everywhere, more often than not in the face of grave danger. Every decade is witness to such movements. Right now, we need look no further than the moving and courageous struggles waged by Iranian women, supported by men, to overthrow not just their hijabs, but also the fundamentalist noose of oppression that has hung around them since 1979. That the women are raising their voices in a context of severe economic hardships, brutal police control, corrupt governance, institutionalized misogyny, and political repression is all the more inspiring. The slogan of the Iranian women's protests is Jin, Jian, Azadi, women, life, and freedom. The origins of this lie in the secular socialist revolution waged by the Kurdish women of Rojava in Syria. For me, the slogan links together a number of progressive movements for women's rights, minority rights, social and economic and political equality, and secular democracy. It comes pretty close to summing up what feminist resistance should look like. I think Charles Bradlaugh would have been proud of the Iranian women. Thank you. I can't hear you, Stephen.
There you go. It's all right. I was unable to unmute myself, but someone's done it for me. So thank you. Thank you, Pragna. Thank you for that wonderful journey through 40 years of social justice activism and struggle, not submission, as the Women Against Fundamentalism slogan said. Obviously, so much ground was covered there, some of which the National Secular Society has been engaged in too.
Yeah.
what really came across to me was the interconnectedness, I think, of the various struggles that you fought against: racism, sexism, religious fundamentalism. That really came through. And it seems to me that identity politics and multi-faithism have really reduced the scope for unity and solidarity within the social justice movement, which seems to me at the moment to be quite fractured, full of infighting, and all very divisive, really. How do you see a way of walking back from that?
I think it's not an easy thing to do, because there's so much that's stacked against us. You know, sort of the forces of fundamentalism have really been unleashed, as we've seen in Leicester. And of course, the state is, you know, on a road towards more and more authoritarianism and not less. And with that, threats to the human rights of everyone. You know, we're seeing the way in which the right to protest is being curbed. The right to access justice has become more and more difficult. And of course, the rights of migrants to claim asylum, you know, is more or less being wiped out. And so I think in this kind of febrile environment, it is not easy to counter the kind of forces, the counter state forces. It's not easy to challenge the kind of counter state forces that I think have been infected by identity politics. And so whether it's the state or whether it's fundamentalists or other social justice movements that only see the state as repression as a problem, we are going to have to work really hard to defend the idea of universal human rights, to defend, you know, the idea that human rights have been fought for by people across the globe. They are neither Western or Eastern, and to defend the right to equality, to freedom, and to justice. I mean, one way of doing that is to remind ourselves of the history, which is why I labored that point, you know, in my talk, because I think that the early history, they were fraught with difficulties, but the early anti-racist history did acknowledge that even though we did acknowledge the need for unity and solidarity. So even though, you know, they themselves were formed out of a kind of identity politics, I suppose, which is Black identity politics. The point is that they were invested with political values that were progressive, you know, that sought to understand and make those connections between race, class, sex. And so I think more needs to be done to remind the younger generations of that history. And I'm really struck by the fact that somewhere like Leicester, where we're seeing this kind of communalization erupt into violence, you know, there have been some talk in some quarters about the need for the younger generation to come together. After all, they've lived together, worked together, studied together, and yet the younger generation are also part of an identity politics that's based on religion, that's gone from strength to strength. So a lot needs to be done on multiple fronts. We need to defend values of universal values of human rights, equality, freedom, democracy, secularism, but we also, I think, need to challenge the state and its role in all of this, not only in also enacting policies that take all this away, but also in fueling the right-wing forces, you know, and in creating more deprivation and poverty and inequality and divisions, whilst concentrating power, you know, at the central level. So I think these are really difficult moments, but it has to be the case that we can come together, that we can, you know, use identity politics of the old kind as a jumping off point, but not as the end goal, you know, and how, as difficult as things are, they're triply, you know, difficult for women in Iran, women in other parts of the country, of the world, where, you know, they're literally being killed for their beliefs and for their protests. So if they can do it, I don't see why we can't do it. We just have to find a way of understanding that what connects us is our humanity, and to you know, inject, I think, compassion and empathy to our politics as well.
Absolutely. Right. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, do pop them into the Q&A box and we'll get through as many as we can in the remaining time we have left. You mentioned Leicester in your response there. First questions coming from Richard. Pragna, how do you see events developing in Leicester? And what do you think can be done to prevent the situation from worsening there?
Well, I think the first problem is that the hope there is that there have been women who've been raising their voices, saying, look, this is not, you know, they're not doing this in our name. We are women who've, you know, lived in this area side by side. We are communities that have lived side by side, and you know, we will not tolerate this. So there have been some public announcements, particularly by women, that are useful. I don't think they go far enough, but they're useful. If we want to reverse the situation, and of course, as I said in my presentation, there are other voices that have said, you know, what we need is more interfaith networks, which I have found complete waste of time. You know, they sit there and they talk about how to tolerate each other's religion and values and coexist in a kind of really superficial way that doesn't really tackle any of the injustices and inequalities that I've talked about. So I think that the initiatives have to come possibly from women reasserting their autonomous voice. They've got to come from women coming together, regardless of their backgrounds, and forming campaigns and organizations that cross these religious and ethnic and, you know, caste and other divides. What we're seeing at the moment in most minority communities is ghettoizations of minorities, you know, and the fact that they all live sort of side by side doesn't necessarily mean that they're really, you know, that they see themselves as one, that they see themselves as connected. All it is that the community leaderships of those ghettos basically are dictating, you know, what each you know, what they want in terms of government resources and so on, and power. So I think we need to return to setting up projects, youth projects, women's projects that are actually, that cross these ethnic religious divides. And just saying that, you know, we are communities, we've lived together side by side in the past is not going to cut it. We need youth projects. So obviously we need to make demands of the state for funding, for spaces, to have these kinds of, you know, spaces where people can come, not just come together momentarily, but can actually build spaces that challenge the kind of daily injustices that people experience and share experiences, and come together to forge some kind of shared values and campaigns together, you know, as we did in the 80s and the 70s. That's really important. What we're seeing at the moment is more faith-based organizations, and now and again a little exchange between them to show how they're all tolerant of each other. That's not really what the fight for justice is about. So I think Leicester, as in other parts of the country, need to rethink how you know, these secular spaces, inclusive civic spaces, have been shrinking as a result of fundamentalist forces, conservative forces, but also as a result of state policies around cohesion, integration, austerity, privatization, and so on. As I tried to show, you know, in the example that I gave about the sell-off of Southall Town Hall. We also need to challenge some of the key issues that the state, you know, we need to challenge the state in some of the key issues around discrimination against migrants, the kind of policies that bring further deprivation and impoverishment to communities. We need to challenge all of these, and we need to do it together. So I think that, and we need to challenge local political structures that have been responsible for entrenching faith-based leaderships also in political sort of systems of power, and as a result, they've become quite corrupt and rely totally on who can bring, the votes in. So I think all of these things have to be done if there is to be any prevention of what happened in Leicester, elsewhere, because what it is the communalization of the country. It's a communalization of its institutions. It's a communalization of social relations. And it is really just leading to infighting and internal kind of, divisions, rather than actually challenging those who hold power and who don't want to be accountable for abuses of those power.
Yeah, I've always thought organizing around religious identities to be not particularly helpful, not something that the state should necessarily encourage. And you talked there about secular spaces shrinking, but as the state shrinks, as public money dries up, the government seems to want to give a much greater role to religious groups in delivering public services. So one of the questions that's come in actually is that it says the government is working to put more religion into community services, specifically for vulnerable women. So what's your message to the government there?
Well, my message to the government is that it needs to reflect on its policy of multi-faithism. It really does, because all it's done is created the divisions. It's created the environment that has encouraged divisions, and these divisions have, kind of bubbled into violence, communal violence. It's a direct outcome of these multi-faith policies. So we have a paradoxical situation where on the one hand, the government has kind of lauded policies around cohesion and integration, but on the other hand has created the divisions by sort of, if you like, excluding religious leaderships from any kind of notion of accountability and told them to go in, and do their own thing in return for, sort of ensuring that there's no public disorder, and of course the religious leaderships are using this, their kind of the resources they have and the power they have to impose real agendas of social control on women and other minorities. We are seeing that the direct consequences of the shrinking of the welfare state, because when you shrink that space, you create that vacuum, and who fills that vacuum is the issue, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And it's the religious institutions that are readily and more able to fill that vacuum, because they have the networks, they have the resources to provide the services that the state should be providing. And that's another way in which multi-faithism has become entrenched. They're providing the so-called welfare services. They're actually setting up wings, sort of side sort of centers around women, around welfare needs and so on, which means that more and more people, are forced to work within the religious framework in order to meet their daily needs, rather than make, demands of the state in the language of human rights and citizenship rights. So I think these, the state really needs to, and I can't see where that's coming from given the political complexion of the state at the moment. But what we need to do is to really foster human rights and a culture of human rights that has been stifled for so long. And, human rights on so many fronts, whether it's in relation to poverty or homelessness or justice or, elderly care or the care for the disabled. I mean, we need to see a real commitment to human rights. And instead, what we've seen from the state is rolling back from that, threats, at least, even if they're just political posturing, there are threats to, from time to time to repeal the Human Rights Act or to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights and so on. Whether they're followed through or not, they create a wider environment that actually is trashing, the ideals that around people have, which people have fought for since the Second World War, and around which people have died and which made lives so much better, for people. The universal health care, education, and so on, legal aid system, all these things matter. So we really need a commitment from the government to approach governance from a human rights framework. And to do that, we need separation of church and the state. That lies at the heart of it, and campaigns around that lie at the heart of it. But, that is important, that there is we do not want to see the privileging of religion. Mm-hmm. We cannot see a multi-faith approach which seeks to privilege all religions over the lives of their citizens, and we really need to see the state as a secular institution that is also a guarantor of people's rights and freedoms.
Yep. One of the questions that just came in actually was related to that point. I think in some ways, the Church of England, being the established church and privileged in the way in which it is, kind of holds the door open for minority faiths as well to play that role in society. And one of the questions that's coming from John was, it says, would abolishing clerical representation in the second legislative chamber, so the bishop's bench in the House of Lords, would getting rid of that help in some way in the struggle for equality and equal human rights for all?
Absolutely. And I think people far better than me, Geoffrey Robertson, talked about the disestablishment of the church, in a previous lecture. I would say that that's a really important start, that we do talk about and realize that separation between church and state. And it's important for all the reasons that I've outlined, but particularly for women and minorities, who are so amenable to religious governance, because the state doesn't really interfere too much in the lives of minority communities in particular. And although we've made great strides around that, through the legislation around forced marriage, honor-based violence, all of that, we still have a situation, particularly where the welfare state is shrinking and religion becomes more and more powerful. We see the ways in which religion is governing once again women's lives, and we see the way in which women are being denied access to the formal legal system and therefore to their human rights. So I think the separation of church and state is a starting point. The fact that the Church of England has that privileged position is really problematic, and it's what's allowed all these other religions to muscle in, And at the time when we were supporting Rushdie and challenging Muslim fundamentalism in that case, we also demanded the abolition of blasphemy laws at that time, which privileged Christianity, because we could see that those blasphemy laws, if allowed to stay on the books, would also be used by the other religions, to suppress freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, as we have seen. And similarly, we also campaigned for, all schools to be state-run and to be secular in their complexion, rather than what we've seen today was the mushrooming of religious schools, which lead to the kind of problems that we had to deal with when we tackled gender segregation at the Al-Hijra school. This is the outcome, these are the outcomes. And they are particularly devastating for those who are the most vulnerable and the most powerless in our communities. So, religion is filling that space that the state should occupy, and we cannot get rid of that if the Church of England continues to have its privileged position.
Absolutely. And thank you, because you've answered one of the other questions there, which was asking what was your view on faith schools, but I think that's come across quite clear. So obviously anti-racism has formed a significant part of your campaigning over the years. And I imagine you've seen a fair amount of anti-Muslim bigotry as well in the course of your work. At the same time, there's a question here saying that you've been a critic of the adoption of an Islamophobia definition that defines Islamophobia as a form of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness, I think is the term. So what's your concern with that definition?
Well, our concern with that definition is that the exact meaning of Islamophobia is nebulous. It doesn't, it's not very easy to pinpoint, and particularly legally, it's not very easy to define. And that it is going to be used not so much to deal with anti-Muslim racism, as I call it, but actually to deal with dissent.
Yeah.
And so that was the crux of the submission that we made to the consultation committee, the APPG, on the working definition of Islamophobia. I was actually one of very few voices that was invited, and I think because they wanted to give the appearance that they were neutral, and it was a neutral consultation. It was chaired by Baroness Marcy. But I actually had a very hard time arguing that there is a reality, there is anti-Muslim racism, and it needs to be tackled, but that this was not the way to do it, because the definition couldn't have, has multiple meanings for different people, and would be used as would be weaponized in relation to free speech and dissent from within a religion. Baroness Marcy and the others didn't buy my arguments, and obviously went on to recommend, that working definition of Islamophobia that's particularly, I think that it's loose, it's woolly, it's problematic. But one of the things that I realized afterwards was that it also emboldened the Hindu right to come up with a definition of Hindu phobia, and to campaign for that to be recognized in law, in relation to so-called racism against Hindus that they were saying. And when you look at the actual examples of Islamophobia or Hindu phobia that's been presented in support of these arguments for these definitions, these terms to be recognized, what you see is just plain straightforward racism, and where people aren't distinguished because they're Muslim or Hindus or Sikhs, then most of the time, those who are perpetrating violence can't even recognize that background, and they're just engaged in straightforward racism. So, these are disingenuous attempts to use religion to police dissent, to police speech from within. And that's exactly what's happened. I mean, I haven't seen the Hindu right come out against, the racism of the immigration laws, the policies that, might send asylum seekers to Rwanda, or the racism in the workplace, that still exists, or institutionalized racism that still exists. But what I have seen them do is use the term Hindu phobia to prevent exhibitions, because those exhibitions are critical of religion, or to prevent feminist voices of dissent from within, because they challenge the patriarchal status quo, and the same for Muslims who use the term Islamophobia. And the other thing is that it's very easy to label someone as Islamophobic and Hindu-phobic, in ways that, makes it difficult to counter. But I think the other problem with the adoption of these terms, I haven't seen the Sikhs come out with a Sikh phobia or something term yet, but that's there, I suppose, on the cards. But what I think it does also more broadly is it communalizes our politics, doesn't it? Because we're not talking about the racism, we're not talking about the anti-racism of the past, where we came together because we recognized, racism manifests in lots of different ways. For Afro-Caribbean youth, it manifests more in terms of police stop and search. For Asians, it often manifested more in terms of immigration policies that prevented family reunification or virginity testing of Asian women. But there were nevertheless manifestations of racism, and they still enabled us to come together to challenge the racism of the state and the policies that were being enacted in the name of the state. What we have here with terms like Islamophobia and Hinduphobia is basically attempt to protect religion from any kind of scrutiny and to communalize communities and to enable the religious leaderships to, lord over communities that they claim are theirs and to, consolidate more and more power to themselves.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think we've got time for two quick final questions. We'll try and wrap up just after 3:30. So question from anonymous attendee. I was wondering what policies and laws are in place to control the work of Sharia tribunals and other faith-based tribunals used for divorce proceedings. So yeah, obviously they constitute a fairly dangerous parallel legal system to family law in the UK. So yeah, what policies are in place to limit their work or control their work?
None.
Or should there be?
Absolutely none. Of course there should. And together with One Law for All, for the last decade or so, we've been, challenging these developments. We have, we were opposed. We gave submissions. We made submissions to the parliamentary inquiry that was set up on Sharia laws. And they didn't really hear from many of us, but they wanted to hear a lot from women who were pro-Sharia laws and these, parallel legal systems. But we boycotted the inquiry that the government had set up on Sharia laws that was chaired by Mona Siddiqui, I think it was her name, some time ago now. But that inquiry we boycotted, we meaning One Law for All and Southall Black Sisters, because it was chaired by her and she's a scholar of theology, not a human rights lawyer, and she was chairing a panel of people who were theologists, who were clerics, Muslim clerics, and there was also someone from a Christian fundamentalist background who was also a lawyer, so it felt like the whole thing had been set up, and been framed in a way that never was going to take any of our concerns about parallel legal systems seriously. So we had no choice but to boycott that. I mean, if the state was serious, they would have put a human rights lawyer in charge, and experts who understood equality law and discrimination law and so on, as they've done in other inquiries. So that was very disconcerting for us because it really meant that the state was not taking any of this seriously. The parliamentary hearings on Sharia laws, we did make copious written submissions from, absolutely dissecting the issue from all angles. But for some reason it was suspended and then it never produced anything. Mm-hmm. And since then, the state is not interested at all. And in the meantime, more and more women are being coerced. Religion is being used to coerce them into unregistered marriages, which means that their rights are not protected, that they're coerced into relationships of violence and abuse, that they're denied inheritance, that they're denied equality, and so on in their communities. So it's quite a chilling situation that we're in terms of the denial of women's access to justice. Mm-hmm. And I wish I could say that, the state was actually paying attention and doing something, but from what I can see, it's doing sod all. And it will be left to feminist organizations and, campaigns like One Law for All to carry on highlighting these atrocities and these injustices.
And carry on we will. Okay, one final question. Going forward, what are the big challenges for secularist feminists on the horizon, do you think?
I think we have to challenge authoritarianism in all its forms. Unless we do that, we're in an era, I think, where authoritarianism has gained ground, is now in power in lots of places, and it's now posing huge problems. It's not just about religious authoritarianism, it's also far-right authoritarianism. You know, we've seen what's happened in Italy recently, perhaps what's going to happen in Sweden. And all of this has to be a feminist concern. I mean, you know, I think a lot of feminism is kind of shrunk downwards into this kind of defense of sectional interests. And we've lost a wider political analysis and perspective that's needed around authoritarianism, around the defense of secular democracy, because without it, these kind of sectional interests that we have are threatened all the time. We've seen it. They can be taken away overnight, as we've seen in, you know, in relation to the abortion rights of women in the US, you know, the repeal of Roe versus Wade. So I think for me, the most urgent task of feminists is to challenge authoritarianism of the state and authoritarianism within our communities, because both are working hand in hand, as we've seen, and both pose a huge threat to our freedoms and our rights, because both are fascistic in nature. And if we're not careful, we will be sleepwalking into fascism, you know. So for me, that is the biggest challenge for feminists, defending secular democracy and principles of secular democracy, challenging fascism, authoritarianism, religious fundamentalism. And if we don't do that, we're not going to win those rights, whether it's for minorities, for women, for climate change, for the poor. You know, those are the big, big challenges, I think, that are ahead for us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pragna. That was, I think, alarming, depressing, and inspiring in equal measures, a very important call to action. So thank you very much for joining us. It is time to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If you want to find more out about the work of Charles Bradlaugh, please do visit the Our Stories section of our website, where you can do that. And if you support our work, please do join us. All of our work is funded by our members and supporters. So if you do support it, please do join us, and we'll put your principles into action. Before we go, I just want to say a quick thank you to Buddha and Megan on the NSS staff team for their support today. And a massive thank you to Pragna for such a rich, reflective and inspiring Bradlaugh lecture. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.